Hi, everyone. I'm Suma, and this is Peter Mary. Peter is co-founding Chief Innovation Officer at Ubiquity, a founder of the Center for Human Emergence based in Netherlands, and a founding partner of Engage. Peter has an MSc in Human Ecology from Edinburgh University and PhD from Ubiquity's Wisdom School on Volution theory. Today, we are going to discuss his thoughts on interconnectedness and science of consciousness. And we'll also touch some points on his ideas on evolutionary theory. Welcome, Peter. Thank you so much for your time.
Hey, thank you, Suma. Thanks for the invitation. Good to be here.
I've been really looking forward to this conversation. I discovered you because of Nish Dubashia. I saw your conversations with him, and I was really intrigued by your depth into some of these topics on a wide spectrum, non-duality, integral theory, and evolutionary theory. So that's why I've been very much looking forward to get your insights on this. I was thinking maybe first we could begin with interconnectedness and science of consciousness. Maybe that could be a good starting point.
Sure. Yeah. Yeah, big topic. I mean, maybe to start with, my interest in that area is, I guess, based on a sense that the reason that we're in such a mess as humanity at the moment is that we've forgotten the nature of our interconnectedness. We've forgotten essentially that, we are the earth. And it's a kind of silly thing, really, to forget. But even, right now, I'm the earth talking to itself, right? And you're the earth, and everyone who's listening is the earth listening to itself. So this is the earth trying to work out, what do we do with this thing called humanity that we gave birth to? And can humanity continue in such a way that, all life flourishes rather than all life getting damaged, which is the case at the moment. So, the need to remember our interconnectedness, I think, is deeply connected to the possibility we have of continuing as a species on the planet. Because if we hadn't forgotten that we were deeply interconnected with all of life, then we wouldn't have been able to do what we've done to the planet or to each other, because we would have realized, well, actually, it's, we're related to it all. And yet somehow on our journey, we lost touch with that experience and the understanding, particularly as we kind of, in the West, as we jumped into the Western rational kind of scientific mindset that takes everything apart but forgets that it's all fundamentally connected, into what Nish would call fragmentation, which is the kind of negative side of distinction. So obviously everything being differentiated in the sense of understanding and appreciating the diversity of things and the difference is a good thing. But if we then go on to believe that all these things are completely separate from each other, we get into fragmentation and we get into the mess that we're in. So that's really why, I've kind of focused on this topic of interconnectedness. And obviously a lot of the spiritual traditions all describe an interconnected nature of reality. But in the West, we've kind of moved away from that and, put science up on a pedestal. So when I came across the work that was done at Princeton University for 28 years, that basically demonstrated that there was some kind of field interconnecting all of us, then I realized here was a great opportunity to use some science to help the Western mind bridge into this idea of interconnectedness. So maybe it's an idea just to share a little bit about what that research was and what they were doing there. So back in the 1970s, it was actually McDonnell, the aircraft maker, came to Princeton School of Engineering and said, we seem to be seeing that our pilots, when they get stressed in the cockpit, influence the dashboard of the fighter aircraft, wherein they have no physical connection to that dashboard. So It's all a bit spooky, you know, we don't really understand it. Can you find out what's going on? And that started 28 years of research that was called the Princeton Engineering Anomalies Research. And anomalies, because anomalies are things that don't fit in the current mindset or understanding. So PEAR gives you pair, so it was known as the pair lab. And what they were researching was whether people's intention and inner state could somehow affect the world around them. And they did that by creating what should be random technologies around them. So technologies producing random results, and then seeing whether people's intentions and things would affect what by all other science should be just random output. One of those, for example, to start with, was a very big, like, pinball machine on the wall that dropped 9,000 balls over a bunch of pegs that created a kind of random chaotic system. And should it all be random, they would just end up in a random Gaussian curve at the bottom of the machine. And then they would have people sit on a couch in front of this machine and try to make more balls fall to the right or more balls fall to the left. And they're not psychics or anything, just normal people. In fact, they explicitly avoided people who had psychic claims. And they found that to a statistically significant effect, people were able to affect the balls on this machine, cascading and making them move more to the right or the left. Small results, but because they could be repeated so often, they gained great statistical significance. And then they started to digitalize the experiments by working with something called a random number generator. And a random number generator, or a random event generator, REGs as they're known, they basically generate lots of ones and zeros very fast, like a digital coin flipper. And that gives you a baseline of 50% ones and 50% zeros. And they are created, this data stream is created through a quantum tunneling effect, which, according to mainstream physics, means that nothing should be able to affect these devices. Nothing in the physical world. There is no explanation for how anything should be able to affect these devices. So, of course, what they found during the research was that people's intention did indeed affect these devices. So they would create interfaces like on a computer screen, a line running across the screen. And if the line went down, you know, it would mean more zeros. There were more zeros. If the line went up, it would mean there were more ones. And they just have people try to influence the screen, basically try to make the lines move up or down the screen. And again, they got, you know, very statistically significant results. The interesting thing is that they found that it was a combination. The strongest effects were when people combined their intention from the mind with their attention from their heart. So when they were able to make a kind of emotional connection to the experience and the device, then that amplified the results. In fact, couples who were in love had the biggest effect of people. So, so what that was showing was that clearly there is something connecting us to this technology around us in a way that normal science can't explain. So somehow our intention and attention, that information is getting transmitted to a device and affecting it in a way that normal science wouldn't be able to find a reason for. So that work continued over 28 years, many different experiments they tried. And by the end of their research, they published it all in peer-reviewed journals. The scientific community, of course, was very skeptical. So they kept demanding higher standards in the protocols. They kept meeting those standards. They kept producing these results. And by the end of it, the likelihood of what they had found being chance was 1 in a billion. So basically, they'd proven beyond statistical doubt that the human mind and heart affect the world around us. So in 2007 or so it was, they closed the lab because the dean of the School of Engineering, Bob Jahn, who had led it, was leaving, was retiring, and they basically made their case. So they closed the lab then, and they put all the equipment in storage. And I got to know Brenda Dunn, who was the woman who was the psychologist in the lab, so who ran the lab with Bob Jahn. And while I was doing my PhD at Ubiquity University. And then in a conversation one day, Brenda said to me, look, we've got all of this equipment, you know, this was a few years ago now, 3-4 years ago, sitting here costing us a fortune in Princeton doing nothing. Could you do anything with it? And it was kind of one of those magic synchronicity moments, because I just met a guy in the UK who owns a 3,000-acre estate in Yorkshire called Broughton Hall, who was committed with his partner to transforming it into a place for the future of humanity, essentially. So they were rewilding the whole estate, planting 1 million trees, and built a beautiful retreat center. And so I thought, well, why don't we create a walk-in public experience where people can come and experience their mind affecting these technologies? Because for me, it would be psychoactive. You know, it would make people go, how does that work? You know, there must be some kind of interconnectedness that I wasn't taught at school. So that's kind of the mission behind it. So he agreed, and the Princeton folks agreed, and we shipped all of this equipment, the whole library, all the research papers and everything across the Atlantic from Princeton to the north of England, and established what we called Wyrd Experience, WYRD. And the reason we chose the word Wyrd is because it's the old Anglo-Saxon and Viking term for the web of interconnectedness that generates all life. And it was only corrupted to mean strange, and the spelling changed later on. It was actually found in a document in the British Library where a monk had written down his experience of an initiation ceremony with the pagans into kind of being a sorcerer, basically. And in that, the word he uses to describe this reality was this word Wyrd. So it was just a normal part of our reality that we accepted, that the shamans of the time, you know, went into the Wyrd space to find out, you know, hints about the future, or help with healing, or soul retrieval, or, you know, all these kind of things. So I thought, well, this is a meme that is connected to the land and the place of Northwestern Europe. So rather than import chi and everything from the East, we should try and awaken the indigenous meme of Wyrd that that kind of resonates with the place and can make it a kind of cool and fun thing. So be proud to be Wyrd. We have kind of weirdo t-shirts and things like that with the Y. For people who are kind of saying, well, actually, I do want to identify myself as someone who understands, experiences, and respects the nature of our interconnectedness. So that's, you know, the story of how we got to this create Wyrd experience. And since then, we further developed the technology, both the hardware and the software, and have just released a device that you can put in a room or a group space, and it'll measure the field of consciousness in that space during an event. So you can see how the event, the things that go on during an event, how they affect the field of consciousness. For example, we have a university in the UK, Northampton University, who are using them in football stadiums to see whether the events that happen during the football matches can be reflected in the field of consciousness. We have other people, facilitators, who use them in groups to see, you know, based on the interventions they make, how those kind of interventions affect the field of consciousness in the group they're working with. Or tracking rituals, tantra rituals. People track tantra rituals to see how the field shifts based on the rituals. But we've also, to come back to the point that we discussed earlier, we've also had them in ICUs, so intensive care units, and they note, you know, when the person passes away, according to the EEG, we also get a data imprint in the weirdoscopes, as we call them, which is essentially showing that something non-physical happens at the time of death, because by the definition of physics itself, nothing should be able to influence these devices. So this device is just sitting there in a room, tracking the field, and the moment somebody dies, it also registers an event. So that's some event in the non-physical field that is going on at the moment of death. So that's pointing to the fact that there must be something non-physical that happens at the moment of death, which of course all spiritual traditions, would not be surprised about. But it's kind of scientific evidence in a way of something going on beyond the moment of death. So that's a lot of what I'm involved in, is developing these, what we call consciousness technology devices. Beyond now, this is a research device, the first one we created, but we're about to create a piece of technology that could be built, that you could build a lamp around, so that the lamp would respond to your intention, glow more or less. If you had it in a group context, it could glow as the group comes into coherence and alignment, and dim down if it doesn't. You could build toys around it, so kids could influence, the way a car moves with their mind, or move a little robot around the room, those kind of things. Really, so that people have an ongoing experience of that interconnectedness, because then they will also want to know, well, how do I engage with that field? How do I make the lamp glow? How do I make the toy move? How do I affect what's going on the football pitch? And of course, that's all inner technology. So then we have to go in and you have to learn, you've got to be able to connect to the heart. You've got to be able to still the rational mind and connect to the intuitive mind. And so it's a kind of Trojan horse in a way to help the Western mindset and culture go and do their personal development, essentially. So and experience and help co-create that interconnectedness. So that's kind of brought you up to date a bit on why and the what of the whole interconnectedness and science of consciousness. Yeah.
Thanks for that update. When I first saw the word, I read it as wired. I thought maybe it means wired into consciousness.
That's also a good interpretation. Wired with.
What is it measuring? Like, how is it able to measure what's happening in the field?
So it's got, at Princeton, they were working primarily with one random event generator. And what they were measuring was the deviation from randomness. So, they had this thing generated ones and zeros, normally 50% of each. And if something was going on, or somebody was trying to intend a shift in the line, for example, they would then look at how much did the data deviate from what should be random behavior. Yeah. What we've done is we've taken now 2 of these REGs, which, according to all kind of materialist science, should produce completely independent random streams of data, right, at all times. There shouldn't be anything that should be able to influence them. So, of course, what we see is they respond to what's going on in the field by creating more ones or more zeros than you should have normally. But what you can also measure is the relationship between these 2 lines. So again, by materialist science, they should operate completely independently. These are 2 independent quantum devices generating ones and zeros in a completely random way. And yet when you put them in the same room, they develop the same data path, data stream, as it were. You can see relationships between these 2 data streams. So that means that we've been able to get a lot more statistical significance on the results than the original work at Princeton, because we're not just measuring deviation from randomness, we're measuring the relationship in the patterns between these 2 separate devices. So basically, that's the way it works. That generates a data output in terms of the probability of what you're seeing being chance. Right? And so, for example, we had during the Science and Consciousness Conference last year, where we had a device running, you had events that were 20, 30,000, 1 to 20 or 30,000 that they happened to be chance. So it's pretty kind of clear that there is a correlation, statistically significant correlation between, for example, the Rinpoche doing his meditation in the morning, and at the same time, you get a peak in the data. Yeah. So that's kind of how it works. Yeah.
And what is your long-term vision for this application? Do you see it making predictions in the energetic field?
I wouldn't necessarily say predictions, although who knows? I mean, for example, when they had a number of the original Princeton-like devices around the world in the Global Consciousness Project, and what they do is they compare the data streams and of these devices around the world. Like a couple of minutes before the planes hit the Twin Tower on 9/11, you got a peak in the data of the REGs of the Global Consciousness Project. So it registered in the subtle field before it manifested in the material world. Just a couple of minutes, right? The thing is, if you pick something up like that, you know something's going to happen, but you don't know what yet. The interesting thing is, though, clearly what it's showing is that reality, let's say, and also as the quantum scientists would describe it, is essentially one big spectrum of information. And that material reality is simply denser information than, let's say, more subtle information of a thought or an emotion that we can't see in the world around us, but we clearly know exists. And that things happen in the subtle information fields before they manifest in our 3D reality. So, just a practical thing, if you're wanting to do something, often we think about doing it first. So the thought exists before we enact it. So it's not rocket science, but it does tell us that there's more of a spectrum of information between subtle information and, let's say, gross or causal subtle gross information fields. It's one spectrum, like the light spectrum, where we accept there's light we can see and then there's light we can't see. It's the same for the information spectrum. There's kind of material information, you could say, that are essentially any standing waves that hold information. And then as you get into the subtle fields, then they're less fixed. So it's all wave form of probabilities, essentially. So when you're working with intentions or affirmations, what you're doing is you're influencing the probability of something manifesting in the material world. Now, there's never a guarantee. It's not as simple as I want a red Porsche, boom, there it is, because there's all sorts of other things pulling on those fields, right? But if it's otherwise generally random, then your intention, and particularly if it's amplified through a kind of positive, loving heart energy, will increase the probability of it manifesting.
And maybe it will be able to measure other influences which could be overriding your intention.
Yeah, I mean, it'll pick up anything that's kind of pulling on the field of consciousness, essentially. And although at the moment we're really measuring the quantity of the effect, we're starting to see some patterns, some qualia, some qualitative information in the data. That, because this, for example, with the Tantra events, we've now got 9 readouts from the same ritual. And you're starting to see that there's a pattern in the data that comes back every time. So it's the same ritual, but different people going through the ritual. And so could that be the pattern of this particular tantric ritual, for example? If we took a device to like a Bach concert and the same piece of music in different places, would we see the same pattern? Is there like an informational, energetic fingerprint for particular events or pieces of music or things that are repeated again and again? Quite possibly. I mean, it feels like we're in the very early stages of this right now, which is what makes it very exciting as well. So yeah, we might well be able to discern particular qualities in the information energy field that would give us information about what it is. Who knows? Maybe eventually location. So maybe, that we will in the future, even if it's just a couple of minutes in advance, be able to get prior warning of something happening somewhere.
Yeah.
Who knows?
Yeah, that is very fascinating to be able to observe things even before they actually happen in advance.
Yeah.
And I can see so many different applications for that in terms of health, being able to detect certain things ahead of time before they actually start manifesting in your body.
I mean, what you see in the kind of when you move out of the material into the subtle fields is that time isn't as linear as we experience it here. So at last year's Science and Consciousness event, our theme was Wyrd Time. And we had different researchers who'd been, proper kind of scientific research into the non-linear nature of time. And one of them, for example, was researching how if you Normally, if you have to perform a task, right, you train in advance of the task, and then you perform the task better because you trained rather than not training. What these guys did is they had people train after the performance of the task and found that they also perform better than if they hadn't trained at all. So the what they call retrocausality. So you do something in the future and it seems to affect something in the past. But even thinking of future and past as a linear process, that's what befuddles the mind, because essentially it's not linear and in that dimension.
That's very interesting. So basically, so going back to what we were talking about, linearity of time, I wanted to zoom out a little bit and see in terms of linearity, and apply that concept more on an evolution perspective, where when we talk about the, usually in mainstream, when we talk about evolution, usually the concept is as we evolve, things keep on getting better and better. We keep on getting nicer and more compassionate. But my question for you is, maybe even evolution is not linear. Maybe evolution doesn't mean you keep on making progress. It may mean that we may see both progress in positive as well as progress in negative. It's just our perception widens. We are able to see more, and not necessarily like we become nicer and nicer. What are your thoughts in terms of evolution and linearity of evolution?
Well, you've asked a question that points to 7 years of research that I did for my PhD dissertation. So we could spend a long time on that. And as you'll see, it ended up being called this, right? Which is not evolution or involution, but volution. So yeah, I have a bit to say about that. I mean, I think essentially, it's about our perception of the world around us, right? It's all about how we experience the world around us. And if we go back to pre-industrial, even, pre kind of farming, more tribal times, then people didn't experience time as linear. They experienced it as cyclical. And it's kind of hard for us to comprehend, because we may think that it's a universal given that time is linear, but actually it's not. It's actually quite a recent development in the human story that we start to experience time as linear. When we were living more in a tribal context where there was a lot of ritual and it was a lot more kind of in the moment, we weren't really planning for things. We were kind of engaging with what we experienced as an interconnected web of reality and beings and life around us, without really having a sense of being separate from it, right? In that context, we didn't experience it as linear, we experienced it as cyclical. And then what happened was that at some point we developed the capacity to see ourselves, well, to become aware of ourselves as separate entities, really, which was for the Earth. Remember, this is the Earth evolving, right, through humanity. For the Earth, it was an evolution of learning to see ourselves as, to be able to see and reflect on ourselves. So this was a major leap for the Earth through human consciousness, to be able to suddenly be able to see and reflect on itself, ourselves. But and this is in childhood development, we still go through the same journey from 2 to 3 or so. It's the development of what in psychology one calls the ego, which is the sense of separate self, which in itself is a very healthy development, because it gives one the ability to sit back and reflect on things and notice self and notice other, and see the diversity of things and have conversations about them and plan things and that kind of thing. But in healthy psychological development, or any kind of development, when you move from one stage to another stage, the healthy process is you transcend the previous stage. So you differentiate from it. You see, okay, I'm moving on from that, but then you wrap it back in to the journey. You reintegrate it, you transcend and you include. What tends to happen often, at smaller or larger scales, is rather than just differentiating from the past, we disassociate with the past. That means that we imagine that we are separate from it and we kind of deny it, maybe because we had a painful experience in the past, or we really had a lot of emotion and anger about needing to move on, or we had a lot of fear about our experience from the past. But either way, we split it off and we deny its existence, and we do everything we can to suppress it and keep it down. Now, at the individual level, that goes into what we now call in psychology our shadow. So it kind of hangs around in our unconscious, and it continues to sabotage everything that we do until we pay attention to it and reintegrate it. So that's what's going on, when our shadow is kind of comes to the surface and disturbs what we think is our normal way of being. It's because it's asking for attention and telling us we need to kind of look it back, reintegrate, and release the energy that's held there. So that's one of the core pieces in Volution, is that often in order to take a next step forward, we have to integrate something from the past that's holding the energy to allow us to make that leap, basically. So rather than it just being from, in that way, there's a kind of more cyclical integrative process that I frame more in the toroidal form, or the form of a torus or a shape, more of a breathing process as well, where we kind of breathe out to connect the future and past, to breathe into the present the whole time. And the whole time we're kind of integrating possibilities defined by the past and probabilities coming in from the future. And so that's why it's less linear than we think. So what happened in our human story is that we got to that point where we transcended our non-linear past, as it were. We developed this sense of separation that also gave us, that's at the time that the whole linear experience of time came in to our awareness. We started experiencing things sequentially, like they were separate in space and they were kind of differentiated in time, which is why we started agriculture, rather than meeting our needs in the immediate present, we started planting things for the future. And we didn't do that before because we didn't have a linear sense of time. And so that is all well and good, except for the fact that instead of transcending and including, we transcended and repressed in the West anyway. So we kind of pushed away that sense of being the earth, that sense that was related closely to what we would call the feminine archetype. We kind of repressed anything to do with the body, which is related to matter and therefore the earth. And it all became a story of ascension or evolution. And of course, when the church came in, that content, as it were, fell onto that code. And so you got content in different expressions of cultural content in the religions that pointed to a God being outside of the material world. Because what we mainly had to focus on when we were living on the earth was getting out of the earth to heaven. Everything that we were doing was in the context of trying to escape the material. And anything material was bad. Emotion was bad. The feminine was bad. The earth was bad. This is why the witches were burnt and persecuted, because they were an embodiment of all the things that that next stage of development was trying to get beyond, but wasn't able to transcend and include and wrap back in, but transcended and repressed. And that created the foundation for the evolution of industrial society, which is the reason we've got this big ecological and social crisis on our hands, because we continued to proceed as all these technologies came in, from coal, to electricity, and all the fossil fuel driven growth from the Industrial Revolution burst into this context where we were a civilization unrooted from its context, unrooted, believing that everything was separate and we could do anything we wanted and there wouldn't be repercussions, because it was all, as science was telling us, all separate, distinguished, that it was just matter, and there was dead matter and there wasn't anything else. So that's what kind of generated this massive exploitation of the earth and of people through the Industrial Revolution. And that's what drove us into this linear, well, part of that was this linear experience of time, forgetting that there is also a non-linear kind of synchronicity, kairos, as the Greeks would call it, element of time. And that's what has driven also a lot of our stress psychologically, because we're always trying to move forward, right, and improve and get better and progress, and there's no satisfaction, because in the kind of earlier stages, as it were, when you reconnect those and integrate that sense of interconnectedness and belonging, then we realize that we're already at home, you know, we're already there, you know, we're already part of this thing. There isn't anywhere we have to go. And that kind of then ties into, I guess, a post-material or post-trans-rational experience of oneness and beingness. But this time we're conscious of it. So, you know, pre that rational development and pre that separation of the ego, we just lived unconsciously in that sense of interconnectedness. But we didn't sit around and talk about it with each other or reflect on it. It would just, that was the way we lived. And then we developed this sense of separation and distinction. We forgot to wrap back in the you know, the interconnectedness, which meant all our development has been kind of haywire because we've not been rooted. It's created all the mess that we're in. But now, as we're starting to realize, we need to go back and we need to reintegrate that split, then that's what's giving us the capacity to be able to then not just have a transcendent experience of oneness, because what use is that if you can't bring it back into the world, right? Because the point is, you know, we chose to incarnate in this life at this time to do something of service somewhere to life. So we've got to bring it back into the world, which is why the integration of the body, you know, of the feminine, of the heart, of our relationship to earth and the rest of life is critical as the grail container for the kind of higher consciousness that has then a place in which and a channel through which it can manifest. And then, so when you move into that space, you integrate a linear and non-linear time. So we know that there is a linear experience of time, but we realize that it's just a perspective or an experience. And at the same time, we know, as we were talking about earlier, that there is clearly a non-linear experience of time, even as the quantum physicists talk about, you know, when one particle shifts, the other one shifts at exactly the same time. There is no time between the entanglement. When they're entangled, as they say, like that, they change at the same time. So there is a dimension of reality where there is no linear time. And so we're learning now to work out what does it mean to integrate both of those. And that's why I think the toroidal form, which this is meant to be a depiction of, you know, in the book, the toroidal form is a good expression of that, because it has both a kind of polarity to it and a linearity to it, but it also has a cyclical dimension to it. So the kind of combination, or a spiral, is also a good example of linear and cyclical. You know, you go around in these loops, you come back to the same pattern, the same moment in the spiral, but at a next level, as it were, in a linear context. So yeah, that's a kind of short answer to a not so short answer to a question of linear time. But if you will ask me about my 7 years of PhD research, then
So would you say that to be able to tap into that awareness is kind of the core component to be able to open up to this, because there are so many different kind of qualities we value in our culture, like intelligence or building wealth or health and things like that. But it seems like awareness is the component that that is core to like our existence more than some other qualities that get revered in the society. What is your thought on that?
Yeah, no, absolutely. I'd agree. And it's also the solution to the challenges we're facing, not just from a kind of personal development or cultural expression. When we're, when we experience the interconnectedness, we're more likely to make decisions that reflect the interconnected world we're a part of. So take responsible decisions around, organic food, clothes that are produced sustainably and ethically. All our lifestyle choices become what I call a choiceless choice, because we start to experience ourselves as the earth. So why would you do anything that's damaging? How you would reduce your negative footprint as much as possible, increase your positive footprint. And we're obviously facing a lot of challenges at the moment. I feel that the complexity of them, and this is the reason actually we're on this kind of journey where we're discovering that the complexity of the challenges is beyond, and the speed of the change is beyond the capacity of our rational mind to be able to cope with it. So that means we need to turn to another intelligence, right? And more of an intuitive intelligence, because all the solutions that we need exist in the information field already. So the question is, how do we access them? And you don't do that through the rational, intelligent mind. You do that through the intuitive mind and the heart knowing. So any question that we have, we can find by learning to tune into that field and download, as it were, the insight. And then we can bring in the rational mind and all our great skill in terms of implementing it in an effective way. But the intuition or the mind or the kind of field intelligence needs to lead, and the rational mind needs to follow, as it were. So yeah, absolutely.
And do you think that in like for a very long time, so especially in the mainstream world, the qualities of sensitivity or intuitive mind has been kind of suppressed? Like it's almost seen as a negative. And the overarching theme also of evolution, where we have over time, and a lot of like older literatures point to losing that sense of oneness and becoming a separate self. Do you, and we also see the theme of qualities like intuitive mind or sensitivity has been kind of suppressed and not being like seen as a valuable quality. So do you see that taking an other turn where things are going in a direction where we are starting to embrace those qualities? And I don't want to call it evolution, but more
Volution.
like integration of those things and coming back to a oneness field. Is that the direction things are going?
I think it is. The question is just how quickly it's going. Because the amount of suffering that we experience and create is in a direct relationship to the speed that we develop in the way that you're describing. And I think, well, already people are getting there. Just the fact that these technologies have started to emerge that we were talking about earlier. But it does require, it is definitely an inner journey. It's what I describe as the pain and the promise, which is kind of embedded in the Volution theory, but is also a new book I'm working on, which says essentially that we have to heal the pain of the separation first to be able to get access to the promise of the subtle fields of consciousness, let's say, from which we can massively accelerate, our evolution. Ken Wilber has a beautiful quote in his book Up from Eden, where he says, when the great mother is repressed, the great goddess is concealed. So what he means by that is the great mother is the earth-based kind of intelligence I talked about that we had more in tribal society. When that's repressed, then we don't get access to the subtle information fields, which is what he would describe as the great goddess. And at the same time as our linear thinking evolved in the West, and our alphabet, which is also linear by nature, and our language evolved in that way and everything, that was when the goddess basically disappeared from the culture. You know, it stayed in some of the Eastern cultures for a longer time, and definitely in the indigenous cultures. But in the kind of Western culture, it disappeared. We just got this, you know, one God, basically. So what we're now, I think, discovering is the need to heal that separation, because there's an enormous amount of pain there as well when we realize, you know, that we have been separated from that, the great mother, the earth, our body. There's a kind of enormous grieving process I think we have to go through individually and collectively, as we also realize what we've done, you know, to the earth. It's like the earth, which is us, you know, which is the mother that gave birth to us. It's like, well, look at what we've done. There's a process of grieving and reconnecting, I think, that helps us drop back into that quality of presence and being that enables us to be the grail for the information and subtle energy, you know, to express itself through us. But we don't get that promise until we've dealt with the pain first.
And it seems like this journey, this inner journey, we could be experiencing this at an individual level, but also as a collective level.
Yeah, I mean, collectively, you know, look at the pain at the moment. And the question is, at what point do we collectively decide enough is enough? You know, that we're kind of crazy enough. There was this great kind of film stroke documentary came out, and maybe 10 years ago now, called The Age of Stupid. That was like, put it on an deserted oil platform in the future. And it was this where they created an archive of all the footage, you know, from the news and everything from humanity. And the archivist is looking back at this footage. And the trick is they were using real footage, right? And looking back at everything that happened and the stories we told ourselves, you know, we knew what was going on, and we knew that there was an ecological crisis coming. We knew we were making a mess of things, and yet we failed to act. And that's why they called it the Age of Stupid. You know, when people look back from the future, how on earth are they going to judge like this period? If you just step back and think about it, it's a period of complete insanity. Really, you know, how many species actually feed themselves, you know, with food or drink that's poisonous to their bodies? You know, who actually poisons? You know, no other species does that. You know, who else kind of kills themselves for the sake of a few kilometers, or kills each other for the sake of a few kilometers of land? I mean, you know, it's going to look from the future, if we make it through to a future, it's going to look like a crazy period, like where we really lost our senses, which we quite literally did because of that transcend and repress. You know, we just cut ourselves off at the neck, thinking we could solve everything with our head, and we forgot, you know, the multiple intelligences that are part of reality. Yeah, I'm not quite sure whether that answered the question. But, yeah.
And how does the evolution theory factor in AI into the upcoming growth of humanity? How do you perceive that?
Yeah, well, AI, if you think about it, by definition, is rooted in the past, because everything that AI does is churns through data from the past, right? By definition. So AI is just going to regenerate the past, essentially, because that's by definition what it does. What it doesn't do and what it can't do is sense the future, right? Which is what our intuitive intelligence can do. So AI is like, it's the kind of almost the ultimate expression of the materialist worldview. It kind of cracks everything up into pieces and then tries to put it together into something. Whereas an intuitive intelligence starts from the whole. So it starts from the nature, where the context where everything is already interconnected. And from that, gets the insights around what's needed to be done next. So one is rooted in the past, AI, and our intuitive intelligence is rooted in the future, basically, literally by definition. You know, there's no kind of argument around it. We know AI is just churns through data from the past, and intuition, we know, picks up probabilities for the future. So, you know, what Volution does is it just describes, I call it a philosophy of reconnection, because it describes the nature of how we could think about reality in an interconnected way, in a dynamic way, but that also integrates really the ancient wisdom traditions and modern science, and shows how does this whole information system work. And why is it that when we intend something, we increase the probability of it manifesting, to try to root us in that way of seeing ourselves in the world, where we understand it's all an interconnected dynamic system of information, and everything we do and think affects that field, and that affects the probability of what actually manifests in the world that we usually see around us.
If we had to kind of sum up what we have been discussing so far, Peter, how in a person's inner journey, like what are the major hallmarks, do you think, of that one may experience, when they are on this journey, and maybe sharing your own like major points of transformation?
I mean, I think the first step is developing the awareness of how our rational mind operates. So that is a basic mindfulness or meditation practice, which was also where I started, that enables us to distance ourselves from our ego, distance ourselves from our experience of separation. So it allows us to notice our mind and everything that it does. And the moment that we do that, we realize that we're not that mind that's thinking all those things. So we must be something bigger than that, because we're witnessing it. So we're not that, but we're witnessing it. So that changes the nature of our identity. So rather than identifying ourselves as this kind of craziness in here, we start to identify ourselves with something else that's witnessing the craziness there, and therefore has a choice as to whether to engage with it or not. Right? And the moment that happens, we start to, I think, come to a rest more, rather than being kind of propelled forward by this non-stop, incessant mind embedded in this culture of non-stop progress. We realize we have a choice, and we're going to go there or not. And so our system starts to relax. And I think it's then, as we grow more sensitive, so then we become more sensitive to the other experiences in our body beyond just the rational. And that is, I think, when we start to realize that, okay, I have this inner world going on as well, because we've now developing the capacity to notice things and not get caught up in them. So I notice these emotions when I relax. I don't get caught up in them, but I notice them. And then at that point, at some point in that journey, we encounter the fundamental pain related to the experience of separation, essentially. And that's where, we best process that with others. So, not just on our own, but in a community, in a Sangha, or with a therapist or a coach or whatever it is, can help us to process that experience of separation. And once, as we do that, that's when we come back into a more natural way of being, I'd say, a kind of natural simplicity, or a simple quality of presence, where we're not always trying to run ahead of ourselves or run ahead of everybody else, but we can really be with everything that is there. And that's when we, like, as Ken would say, reintegrate the Great Mother, also our connection to the rest of life. So when we settle in, that's when the kind of higher knowing, as it were, opens up again and starts to drop in. So we notice that the insights that we get come from a different place than from our rational mind. But the first step is we need to learn to become aware of how we're caught up in that mind stuff. And that's why a simple mindfulness or meditation practice is really critical to start with, I think, for most people.
Yeah, I agree. I think that's the most crucial step, because until that realization occurs, I think mind has very tricky ways of creating this mental imitations of those states, and until it fully plays out its tricks and it's done, then the real integration begins.
Yeah.
And the post-realization part for the integration, I think that's the part where not much has been described. It seems we have to.
Well, you do see now a lot. It's interesting because obviously that that separation is a experience, is a trauma in our collective intelligence, in our collective field as the West, and plays out in each individual. And you are seeing the last few years a lot more around trauma. So you see Thomas Hübl doing the kind of collective trauma stuff, Gabor Mate's stuff around trauma. Trauma has become a kind of bit of a sexy thing now. It's like, oh, everyone's into trauma, which when you step back and look at it is interesting, because that means people are engaging in this question of integration. Really. So how do we go back, find out where the trauma is, what that separation or splitting off is about, and how we reintegrate it. So that's a good sign, I think, for me, because it means that we are on that journey.
Thank you. I really appreciate your time, and I hope I was able to gather most of your insights. If I missed on something, please share before I don't want to take up too much of your time.
Well, people can always go to, I try to share as much as I can about my thoughts and the stuff we're working on my blog at petermerry.org. So people can always go there and read stuff. The Volution book. The other one that is maybe interesting for people who are into this is, what does that mean for leadership? If we adopt that perspective, and I put that together in this book called Leading from the Field, that is more is not just cognitive. It actually tries to avoid cognitive knowing. It's a set of principles that also has, for example, a piece of art associated with it. So the art was channeled by somebody to resonate with the principle, right? To try to give actually that experience of, rather than thinking about this principle, see if you can feel it, because that accesses the other intelligences and helps us to embody it more. So we'd be here a long time if we were to talk about everything I kind of am passionate about, but we got to a lot of good stuff there, so I really appreciate that.
About that book, Lead from Your Field, can you mention just one insight that audience may?
One of those 12 principles in it, but maybe one that, when I'm talking to groups about it, particularly in leadership contexts, that is simple, but seems to land really strongly, is what I call the principles called timing, or progress. Progress. And it just says, pay attention to what wants to happen now and take the next natural step. That's all. And the reason that's important is because we've got into this kind of culture of trying to predict and plan and control our way forward, whereas things are so complex and moving so fast at the moment that if you make a plan, as soon as you take the first step, world has changed and your plan is out of date. So that's why all these things like agile governance come along. It's like, how do you steer in a more agile way? And really what we need to learn to do is at each moment to sense what's true now and feel the impulse for the next step. Take that next step and then sense again. So it's like act and then sense, and then act and then sense. And for a lot of people, that's such a relief because they all think, I have to have a plan, right? I have to know where I'm going or what I'm going to do. But you don't, because if you live in that kind of illusion, you'll just get more and more stressed, because you'll make a plan and your plan is like this, and life happens and your life diverges from the plan, and then you get stressed because the two things, aren't really, you're deviating from the plan, and then everybody gets stressed and upset about it. So to be able to be present with what is the whole time and just take the next natural step is probably the one I would share.
It also reminds me of what you mentioned in the way of Wyrd talk, where that loosening up of Wyrd happens, where you can infuse that is, I guess that is also part of integration, where when you're present in that way, you also receive a lot more because you don't have those rigid ideas.
Yeah. Well, when we're stuck in our minds, the only thing we're really engaging with is our own experience of the past.
Yeah.
By definition, right? We're not even present. The only thing when we're in our minds is we're processing our experience of the past. That's it. And as you say, when you come present and you can kind of park that, then all the other information that's there and all the other senses and all the other intelligence get some space, and get to come in. And as we know, they are actually much more useful intelligences because they come from a place of wholeness and interconnectedness, and potentially a future, rather than a place of separation in the past, which is what the mind does.
That's a wonderful insight to wrap up this conversation with. Thank you so much, Peter. And at some point, I would love to get your insights on spiral dynamics and do a deeper dive on integral theory.
Yeah, happy to.
Thank you.
All right, thanks, Suma. Bye for now.